The rain drummed steadily against the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, casting a gray veil over the bustling Wednesday morning. Inside Rosie's diner, the scent of sizzling bacon, fresh eggs, and the strong coffee mingled with the warmth of idle chatter and the rhythmic clatter of silverware. It was the kind of place where regulars found comfort in routine, where truckers refueled before another long stretch of highway, and where the weary sought momentary solace in a hot meal. A faded ceiling fan hummed in the far corner, adding to the quiet, unspoken cadence of the morning rush. Officer Paul Bennett sat alone in a worn-out booth, his fingers curled around a cup of black coffee, his scowl deepening the already pronounced lines on his weathered face. At 48, he was a man known throughout town, stern, abrasive, and to many, downright insufferable. He watched the world through jaded eyes, unimpressed by its movements, unimpressed by people, unimpressed by anything outside his own worn-down reality. As the morning unfolded, the door to Rosie's swung open, letting in a gust of cool, rain-scented air. A woman stepped inside, composed and dignified despite the dampness in the air. She was tall, poised, somewhere in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentation. She carried herself with an effortless authority, her spine straight, her movements deliberate. And yet most patrons were too engrossed in their breakfast and idle gossip to truly take notice of her presence. She approached the counter, studying the menu with quiet patience, as though considering whether she wanted coffee, a full meal, or perhaps something else entirely. To Paul, however, her hesitation was an irritation, an obstacle in the already slow-moving rhythm of his morning. He narrowed his eyes, his temper fraying at the edges. "Move it along, lady," he barked, his voice slicing through the subdued hum of the diner. "Some of us have places to be." The room fell into a hush. Conversation stalled. Forks hovered in midair, and a few patrons glanced up, sensing the sharp shift in the atmosphere. The woman turned slowly, one eyebrow lifting ever so slightly as she regarded Paul with a level gaze. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm yet calm, devoid of the knee-jerk anger that might have met his hostility. Paul leaned back against the booth, his chest puffing slightly, his uniform stretching taut across broad shoulders. "Yeah, you heard me. You're holding up the line. Some of us actually have jobs to get to." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some turned away, pretending not to notice, while others subtly reached for their phones, sensing something was about to unfold. The woman remained utterly composed, her gaze unwavering. "You're out of line, officer," she stated, her voice carrying an unshakable certainty, the kind that refused to be rattled by men like Paul Bennett. His expression darkened. A slow, creeping rage unfurled inside him, twisting his features into something uglier than before. With an exaggerated motion, he shoved himself up from the booth, looming over her in a display of dominance. "Out of line," he echoed, his voice a low growl. "Lady, you don't know who you're talking to." "And neither do you," she replied smoothly, her voice unyielding, unshaken. Something in her tone, something in the absolute control she held over herself, set his temper ablaze. Without thinking, without considering the weight of his actions, he spat at her feet, the vulgar sound slicing through the thick silence that had overtaken the diner. The world seemed to stop. The air turned heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words, held breaths, and the slow dawning realization of just how deep a line had been crossed. A man near the counter tensed, his fingers tightening around his phone as he recorded, capturing a moment that could not be ignored. A man at the counter muttered under his breath, "Oh, he's done for." His words were barely above a whisper, but the weight of them settled over the room like an omen. The woman, however, remained poised, her expression unreadable as she allowed the moment to stretch, letting the silence thicken like an impending storm. Then, with deliberate grace, she reached into her pocket, retrieved her phone, and dialed a number. "It's me," she said softly, her tone betraying nothing. "I'll see you soon." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, her departure leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in her wake. Paul rolled his eyes, slumping back into his booth, muttering under his breath, "Drama queen." By lunchtime, Rosie's Diner was no longer just a local spot for breakfast. It had become the epicenter of a citywide controversy. A shaky video of the encounter had already taken over social media, the caption direct and damning: "Cop disrespects black woman at diner." The footage, grainy yet unmistakably clear, captured Paul's outburst, the crude spit at her feet, and the woman's calm, dignified response. It didn't take long for the outrage to spread like wildfire. "This is exactly why we need accountability in law enforcement," one commenter wrote. "Unacceptable behavior from someone in uniform," another post read. Some tried to defend Paul, arguing that the video lacked context, that it had been edited to paint him in the worst light possible, but most weren't convinced. By the time local news stations picked up the story, it had already gone viral, dominating evening broadcasts, sparking debates, and reopening wounds that the city had never truly healed from. Commentators dissected every second of the footage, analyzing what it meant for the broader conversation about power, race, and policing. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Paul sat at his desk, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beyond those walls. He laughed with his colleagues, swapping stories as if the morning's events were nothing more than a fleeting irritation. To him, it was just another day. But his indifference shattered the moment Captain James Weller stormed into the room, his face red with barely contained fury. "Bennett, my office, now!" Paul groaned but obeyed, grumbling under his breath as he followed Weller inside. The moment he stepped into the office, however, his arrogance wavered. On the captain's laptop screen, the viral video played on an endless loop. The footage of his own actions, the spit, the sneer, the hostility, reflected back at him, damning in its finality. "What the hell is this?" Weller's voice was sharp, each syllable laced with pure, unfiltered rage as he jabbed a finger at the screen. Paul shifted uncomfortably, trying to muster the bravado that had carried him through so many situations before. "Some woman at the diner," he scoffed. "She got mouthy, so I put her in her place." Weller's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That woman," he said, voice shaking with fury, "is Regina Taylor, the new chief of police. She starts tomorrow." Paul's stomach plummeted. His throat tightened. "What?" he choked out, as if he had misheard. Weller's glare was cold, his expression carved from stone. "Because of you, this entire department is under a microscope. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Paul opened his mouth to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. Every excuse, every weak defense, every justification died before it could be spoken. Weller cut him off. "Save it. This is career-ending, Bennett." The next morning, the tension in the Montgomery Police Headquarters was suffocating. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their gazes skimming over Paul as he made his way through the halls. No one needed to say why. Everyone already knew. Today marked the arrival of Chief Regina Taylor, and everyone knew she would have something to say about what had transpired. The department gathered in the conference room for her formal introduction. When she entered, she moved with the same unshakable composure she had displayed at the diner. Her presence was powerful, not because she demanded attention, but because she commanded it effortlessly. Taking her place at the podium, she surveyed the room, her gaze lingering briefly when it found Paul sitting in the back. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I am Regina Taylor, and it is my honor to serve as your new chief of police. My mission is simple: to restore trust, to ensure accountability, and to uphold the dignity of every citizen this department serves. Her words cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unwavering. Their weight settled over every officer, pressing against them, demanding to be heard. What followed in the weeks to come was nothing short of a transformation. Regina wasted no time. She implemented immediate reforms, mandatory de-escalation training, a new community oversight committee, and stricter disciplinary measures. She wasn't simply reacting to Paul's actions. She was working to ensure that such incidents never happened again. As for Paul, his punishment was swift. He was placed on probation and reassigned to a community outreach program. At first, he scoffed at it, treating it as nothing more than a humiliating chore. But as he stood before skeptical neighborhood kids, their eyes filled with doubt and mistrust, something inside him began to shift. "Why should we listen to you?" one boy challenged, his voice raw with years of justified resentment. Paul had no answer. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of his actions, the damage, the scars, the history he had so easily dismissed. Months passed, and change, slow but undeniable, took root. Officers who had once grumbled about Regina's reforms found themselves listening, really listening to community members. They heard the stories they had ignored for years, and Paul too began to change. He worked alongside youth programs, tutoring kids, organizing basketball games. He realized that trust wasn't given, it had to be earned, and he had a long way to go. One evening after a game, a young girl approached him, her arms crossed, her expression skeptical. "Are you really trying to change?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Paul knelt to meet her gaze. For once, there was no arrogance, no bluster, just honesty. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I'm trying." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. We're watching you." Her words stayed with him. A year later, Regina Taylor stood before a packed audience at a public forum. Officers, community leaders, and citizens filled the room, all gathered to mark the progress of a year's worth of change. "When I took this role," she said, her voice resolute, "I knew change wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. Accountability doesn't mean perfection. It means owning our failures and working to do better." Her gaze swept the crowd before settling on Paul, who sat among them, no longer the man he had once been. Officer Paul Bennett has taken that lesson to heart. He faced his mistakes, and he chose to change.